The streets of Boston in the 1980s were ruled by fear. Not by law, not by order, but by one man's absolute control. His name was James Whitey Bulger, and for 10 years, he operated in plain sight. No aliases, no safe houses hidden in foreign countries, no underground bunkers. He walked into restaurants, he attended family gatherings. He drove through the same neighborhoods where FBI agents were stationed, watching, always watching, yet never moving. Everyone knew who he was. Newspaper photographers captured his image. Witnesses saw his face. Informants reported his movements. The FBI had recordings of his voice. Conversations where he discussed crimes with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself invincible. Yet between 1975 and 1985, James Whitey Bulger, the most violent, most ruthless, most powerful organized crime figure in Boston, was never arrested. Not once. Not even questioned in a meaningful way. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't bad luck or missed opportunities. This was a choice. Imagine Boston in those years. Winter arrives early, bitter, and unforgiving. Snow piles up on the streets of South Boston, the Irish neighborhood where Bulger ruled. The cold seems to seep into everything. The brick buildings, the small shops, the bars where men gathered to conduct business both legal and otherwise. The neighborhood itself was trapped in a particular kind of darkness. Poverty mixed with tradition. Loyalty mixed with violence. Families had lived there for generations, but many feared leaving because Bulger's reach extended everywhere. If you left, you might return to find your property damaged, your business sabotaged, your family threatened. Bulger controlled the numbers racket, illegal gambling. He controlled protection schemes. He controlled the drug trade. When rival criminals moved into his territory, they disappeared. Sometimes their bodies were found months later, weighted down in harbors. Sometimes they were never found at all. He ran his operation from a modest storefront called the World Loan Company. To anyone passing by, it looked like a legitimate business. But inside, in the back room, decisions were made that determined whether men lived or died. What made Bulger's decade of freedom extraordinary wasn't just that he committed crimes. It was that the evidence against him was overwhelming, and yet nothing happened. The FBI wasn't naive. They had been investigating organized crime in Boston for years. They had resources. They had authority. They had informants throughout the criminal underworld. They should have prosecuted Bulger 100 times over, but something prevented them. In 1975, the same year Bulger consolidated his power over Boston's underworld, something changed at the FBI. A new arrangement was made, though the public would not learn of it for decades. An arrangement so controversial, so ethically compromised that it would shake the very foundations of American law enforcement. The FBI made a deal, not with Bulger directly, not at first, but through intermediaries, through connections, through relationships built on mutual need and mutual silence. The deal was simple in structure but devastating in its implications. James Whitey Bulger would provide information. He would become an informant. He would report on his rivals, his competitors, other members of the Italian mafia who operated in the region. In exchange, the FBI would protect him. They would protect him not just from prosecution, but from the consequences of his actions. What does it mean when the agency sworn to enforce the law becomes complicit in that law's violation? For the victims of Bulger's crimes, it meant something incomprehensible. It meant that their suffering was deemed acceptable. Their deaths, their injuries, their losses, all of it was weighed against the strategic value of having an informant inside Boston's criminal network. A woman watched her son disappear. She would spend years not knowing if he was alive or dead, not understanding that the man responsible was being protected by the very institution that was supposed to serve justice. A family lost their breadwinner to Bulger's violence. Their case went nowhere. No arrests, no consequences. This is what corruption looks like when it wears a badge. The question that haunts this story is deceptively simple. How did this happen? How did one of America's most dangerous criminals walk free while the FBI, arguably the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world, stood by? The answer lies in a web of connections, compromises, and competing interests that reveals something uncomfortable about American justice. Sometimes the line between law enforcement and organized crime doesn't just blur. Sometimes it disappears entirely. In the next chapter, we'll explore how this arrangement began. We'll meet the men who made this deal possible, and we'll start to understand the true price of what the FBI was willing to sacrifice in the name of national security. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you knew your government was protecting a criminal to gain information about a rival gang, would you consider that justice? Or would you see it as corruption? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters. And if you want to discover what happens next, how this arrangement fell apart, and what the FBI was really protecting, subscribe to this channel. We're exploring stories that mainstream media often refuses to tell. Stories where the institutions we trust aren't what they seem. The next chapter will shock you. To understand how James Whitey Bulger became untouchable, you need to understand the FBI in 1975. The agency was facing an identity crisis. For years, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover had publicly denied that organized crime, specifically the mafia, even existed as a significant problem in America. This wasn't ignorance. It was strategy. Hoover's FBI had built its reputation on fighting communists, bank robbers, and kidnappers. Admitting that a vast criminal empire operated within American cities would suggest that the FBI had failed to protect the nation. When Hoover died in 1972, his successor inherited an agency with a credibility problem. The public knew the mafia was real. Newspapers reported on it constantly. Books were written about it. Movies were made about it. But the FBI's track record of prosecuting organized crime was thin. Enter the Boston field office, and enter a man named John Connolly. John Connolly was an FBI agent with Irish roots, which meant he understood Boston in a way many federal agents didn't. He spoke the language of the neighborhoods. He had connections. He knew people. And crucially, he had ambition. In the mid-1970s, Connolly approached James Whitey Bulger with an offer. The details of that initial meeting have never been fully disclosed, but the proposition was clear. Bulger would provide information about rival criminal organizations, particularly the Italian mafia families that operated in New England. In return, the FBI would not arrest him. More than that, the FBI would warn him about investigations. The FBI would help him avoid prosecution. The FBI would, in essence, provide him with protection that extended to active criminal operations. To Bulger, this was an extraordinary opportunity. He was violent and ruthless, but he was also strategic. He understood that information had value. He understood that having the federal government as an ally, however secret that alliance, was worth far more than any criminal partnership. To the FBI, Bulger represented something equally valuable: access, information, intelligence that could be used to pursue higher-profile targets and demonstrate the agency's effectiveness against organized crime. The arrangement operated on multiple levels, each designed to provide plausible deniability while maintaining the relationship. Officially, Bulger was registered as a confidential informant. This gave the FBI legal cover. Informants are protected by law. The FBI is authorized to work with criminals, even violent ones, if the information they provide serves law enforcement purposes. So on paper, everything was legitimate. In practice, the arrangement was something far darker. When investigations threatened Bulger, Connolly would warn him. When witnesses came forward, the FBI would discourage prosecution, arguing that Bulger was too valuable as an informant. When Bulger committed new crimes, and he committed many, there was always a reason not to arrest him. The timing was bad. The evidence was circumstantial. The case might compromise ongoing investigations. Years passed. The 1970s became the 1980s. Bulger's power grew. His violence escalated. His criminal empire expanded. And every step of the way, John Connolly and his FBI supervisors chose to protect him rather than prosecute him. The victims of this arrangement were ordinary people. A man named Roger Cadillac Wheeler was shot dead in his driveway. Bulger was suspected of ordering the hit, but nothing happened. No investigation that led anywhere. No charges. The case went cold. A woman named Deborah Hussey disappeared. She was 16 years old. Her stepfather was part of Bulger's crew, and there were suspicions, later confirmed, that she had been killed by members of Bulger's organization. Her mother spent decades not knowing what happened to her daughter. The FBI knew more than they revealed. They stayed silent. A man named John McIntyre, who worked as an informant for the FBI and happened to be involved in a drug deal that interested Bulger, was kidnapped, interrogated about what he had told the authorities, and then killed. The FBI's records suggest they had advance warning that his life was in danger. They did nothing to protect him. Each of these deaths was a human being. Each represented a family destroyed, a future erased, a life that mattered. And each death was arguably facilitated by the FBI's decision to protect Bulger. When you step back and look at this arrangement, something becomes clear. The FBI wasn't just tolerating Bulger's crimes. They were enabling them. Think about what that means. The institution that exists to enforce the law was, in effect, giving one man permission to break the law, to hurt people, to profit from crime, to build a criminal empire. The justification offered by the FBI, then and later, was that Bulger's information was too valuable. The intelligence he provided helped disrupt rival criminal organizations. It helped with investigations of other suspects. In a cost-benefit analysis, Bulger's value outweighed his victims. This is the kind of logic that corrodes institutions from within. Once you accept that some laws don't apply to some people, that some victims don't matter as much as others, you've crossed a line that's almost impossible to uncross. But the arrangement, for all its power and protection, contained the seeds of its own destruction. People inside the FBI knew what was happening. Not everyone approved. Some agents were uncomfortable with the arrangement. Some believed it was fundamentally wrong. Some worried about the legal implications if Bulger's status as a protected informant ever became public. More importantly, Bulger himself was becoming a liability. His crimes were becoming more violent, more public, harder to explain away. His profile was rising. Newspapers were writing about him. Rival criminals were angry about his apparent immunity. And in the background, other investigations were quietly building. By the mid-1980s, the arrangement that had protected Bulger for a decade was beginning to strain under its own contradictions. Something was going to give. The question now becomes, how long could this go on? How long could the FBI maintain the fiction that Bulger was just another informant when the evidence of his crimes, his violence, and his continuing criminal operations was overwhelming? The answer, as it turns out, involved even more corruption, more complicated arrangements, and an even deeper moral compromise. Here's what I want you to think about. If you were an FBI agent who discovered that your agency was protecting a violent criminal, what would you do? Would you stay silent to maintain the system? Would you speak up and risk your career? Or would you try to find some middle ground? The answer to that question, and the ways different people answered it, is what Chapter 3 is about. Comment below with your thoughts. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter, where everything starts to fall apart, and the hidden truth about why Bulger was protected begins to emerge. This story is about to take a turn that will make you question everything you thought you knew about American law enforcement. By 1985, the arrangement between the FBI and James Whitey Bulger was showing cracks. The problem wasn't that the FBI wanted to end it. The problem was that the arrangement was becoming impossible to maintain in secret. Too many people knew about it. Too many agents were uncomfortable with it. And most critically, Bulger's crimes were becoming too large, too visible, too difficult to ignore. In the mid-1980s, a new FBI supervisor took over the Boston field office. His name was James Ring, and he was deeply troubled by what he found when he arrived. Bulger's file was unusual, filled with gaps, inconsistencies, and a record of crimes that seemed oddly disconnected from any enforcement action. When Ring began asking questions, he was met with resistance. The agents handling Bulger's case were protective of their informant. They argued that he was too valuable to lose. They argued that if the FBI arrested him, it would destroy years of investigative work. Ring wasn't convinced. He began to push back against the arrangement. Not dramatically, not in a way that would create immediate conflict, but persistently. He started building a case against Bulger that would be independent of the informant relationship. Around the same time, other investigations were closing in on Bulger from different angles. The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, had become interested in Bulger's drug trafficking operations. They were building their own case, separate from the FBI's. They weren't part of the arrangement. They didn't know about Bulger's protected status as an informant. From their perspective, Bulger was simply a major drug trafficker who needed to be prosecuted. Simultaneously, Massachusetts State Police and local law enforcement were conducting their own investigations. They, too, were largely unaware of Bulger's arrangement with the FBI. They saw a criminal who should be prosecuted. What was beginning to happen, unintentionally, almost accidentally, was a convergence of investigations that the FBI couldn't control. The secret arrangement worked when only the FBI knew about Bulger's special status. But once other agencies began investigating him independently, the situation became precarious. Inside the FBI, the tension was real. Agent John Connolly, the man who had initially recruited Bulger as an informant, was becoming increasingly invested in protecting him. But Connolly was also facing scrutiny. Other agents were questioning his relationship with Bulger. Some suspected that Connolly's loyalty to his informant had crossed professional boundaries. Other agents, those who weren't part of the original arrangement, were beginning to voice objections. They argued that protecting Bulger was wrong, that it violated the oath they had taken to enforce the law fairly, that it made a mockery of the FBI's mission. These internal conflicts created a climate of tension and mistrust within the Boston field office. The agency that was supposed to work as a unified institution was fractured, divided between those committed to the arrangement and those who believed it was fundamentally wrong. What's particularly striking about this moment in the story is that the people involved weren't cartoon villains. They weren't corrupt in the stereotypical sense of accepting bribes or stealing money. Most of them genuinely believed they were doing what was necessary, making a difficult choice in service of a larger goal. John Connolly believed that Bulger's information was valuable enough to justify the arrangement. FBI supervisors believed that prosecuting Bulger would interfere with ongoing investigations. They believed they were balancing competing interests in a complex situation. But this is how institutional corruption often works. It doesn't usually involve dramatic moments of choice between good and evil. Instead, it involves a series of smaller compromises, each one seemingly justified in its own right, each one eroding the institution's principles incrementally. By the mid-1980s, the FBI's Boston field office had compromised itself so thoroughly that it was difficult to imagine how the arrangement could ever be undone without admitting what had been done. Then came a moment that forced the issue. In 1987, a man named Brian Halloran came forward. Halloran had been involved in criminal activities and had information about Bulger's operations. He had also recently become an FBI informant himself, working for a different agent than the one handling Bulger. Halloran revealed information that directly implicated Bulger in serious crimes. This created a problem for the FBI. On one hand, they had an informant, Bulger, who was supposedly providing valuable intelligence. On the other hand, they had another informant, Halloran, who was providing evidence that would support prosecuting Bulger. The FBI faced a choice. Do you arrest Bulger, knowing that it will expose the arrangement and create enormous scandal? Or do you continue protecting him knowing that you're now actively suppressing evidence from another informant? Before the FBI could make that decision, Brian Halloran was murdered. He was shot in broad daylight as he drove through Boston. The murder was never officially solved, but there was strong suspicion that Bulger had ordered it, a suspicion that was later confirmed. The FBI's response to Halloran's murder is telling. They didn't immediately launch an investigation into Bulger's involvement. Why? Because doing so would have forced them to acknowledge what Halloran had been telling them. It would have required them to act on the evidence against Bulger. It would have exposed the arrangement. So instead, there was a kind of awkward silence. The murder was investigated, but not vigorously. Bulger wasn't questioned as a suspect. The FBI maintained its protective posture. By the late 1980s, it was becoming clear that the arrangement couldn't survive much longer. The evidence was too substantial. The investigations from other agencies were too advanced. The number of people who knew about Bulger's special status was too large. And the pressure, internal and external, was building. More victims were coming forward with information. More witnesses were emerging. More investigators from different agencies were closing in. The FBI was running out of time. What you're beginning to see is a situation where an institution's attempt to hide the truth is becoming more difficult, more costly, and more damaging than simply admitting the truth in the first place. But the FBI would not admit it. Not yet. Instead, they made a decision that would have devastating consequences. In 1986, understanding that Bulger's protection was becoming untenable, FBI supervisors made the decision that would define this entire story. They warned Bulger. They told him to flee. They gave him advance notice that his arrest was imminent. James Whitey Bulger disappeared. He didn't go to trial. He didn't face his victims. He didn't face justice. He ran. And in running, he exposed the entire arrangement. The critical question now is, why? Why would the FBI warn a major criminal that he was about to be arrested? Why would they allow him to flee rather than bring him into custody? The answer is what Chapter 4 is about, and it's darker than anything we've discussed so far. The reasons go beyond protecting an informant. They go beyond prosecutorial strategy. They involve national security concerns, political pressure, and a level of institutional compromise that goes to the very heart of American law enforcement. If you've been following this story, if you've been trying to understand how something this shocking could happen in America, you won't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe to this channel. Drop your predictions in the comments about why the FBI let Bulger escape. And prepare yourself for the final chapter, where everything comes together, and you'll understand why this story has remained hidden for so long. The truth is more disturbing than the crime. James Whitey Bulger lived as a fugitive for 16 years. From 1986 to 2002, one of America's most violent and most protected criminals was hunted by every law enforcement agency in the nation. His face appeared on wanted posters. His story was broadcast on television. The FBI offered a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. Yet during those 16 years, Bulger disappeared as completely as if he had been a ghost. How? The answer lies in understanding what the FBI had already established: that the relationship between law enforcement and Bulger extended beyond Boston, beyond the Boston field office, and into the higher echelons of federal power. The real reason Bulger was protected wasn't just that he was a valuable informant. There was something else, something that goes to the very nature of power in America. Throughout his years as an informant, Bulger provided information not just about the Italian mafia, but about other matters that interested the FBI. He provided information that allowed the FBI to position itself as the agency most effective at combating organized crime. He provided information that enhanced the careers of FBI supervisors and allowed them to claim credit for investigations and prosecutions. But more importantly, Bulger's information had national security implications. Or at least, that's what was claimed. The FBI argued internally that Bulger's intelligence-gathering activities touched on matters related to national security, which gave them special justification for protecting him. We have to be careful here, because the full scope of what Bulger's informant relationship involved remains classified or unclear to this day. But the pattern is clear. The higher you go up the chain of command in the FBI, the more people seem to understand and tacitly accept the Bulger arrangement. This suggests something uncomfortable. It suggests that the protection of Bulger wasn't a rogue operation conducted by a few corrupt agents in Boston. It was something that had buy-in from higher up in the organization. Perhaps not explicit approval, but a willingness to look the other way because Bulger was providing something valuable. When Bulger was finally captured in 2011 in Santa Monica, California, living openly under an assumed name, his location discovered through a tip to the FBI, the first question everyone asked was the same. If the FBI was looking for him, why did it take 16 years to find him? The investigation into Bulger's fugitive years revealed something stunning. During those years, there were multiple tips to the FBI about his location. There were sightings, there was information, and in some instances that information wasn't followed up with the urgency it should have been. This doesn't necessarily mean the FBI deliberately protected Bulger during his fugitive years, but it raises profound questions about whether the FBI's hunt for him was as serious as it claimed to be. When Bulger was finally brought to trial in 2013, the evidence presented was overwhelming. The FBI agents testified, informants testified, victims testified. The full scope of Bulger's crimes was laid bare in court, crimes that the FBI had known about or suspected during the years of his protection. But here's the thing that makes this story so dark. No high-ranking FBI official was prosecuted for protecting Bulger. No supervisor was held accountable for the arrangement. John Connolly, the agent who had initially recruited Bulger, was prosecuted, but for specific crimes related to his actions, not for the fundamental corruption of allowing Bulger to operate freely for a decade. The FBI faced no institutional consequences. The agency issued statements expressing regret about what happened, acknowledging that mistakes were made, but there was no systematic reform, no purge of the agents responsible, no serious examination of how such an arrangement could have been allowed to develop in the first place. Instead, the FBI managed the narrative. They presented Bulger as a problem, a criminal who had manipulated the system, who had exploited his relationship with corrupt agents, who was ultimately caught and prosecuted and died in prison in 2018. But that narrative obscures the larger truth. The FBI itself had been complicit. The institution had made a choice repeatedly over many years to prioritize strategic advantage over justice. We return now to the victims whose names appeared earlier in this story. Roger Cadillac Wheeler, murdered while Bulger operated with FBI protection. Deborah Hussey, disappeared at 16 while the FBI kept silent. John McIntyre, killed by Bulger's crew while the FBI had advance warning. And there were others. Dozens of people harmed, killed, or terrorized during the years of Bulger's protected freedom. None of them received justice in the form of immediate prosecution. None of them saw their victimizer brought to account when he could still be held responsible in real time. Instead, they waited. They waited for the day when the FBI finally decided that Bulger was more of a liability than an asset. That day didn't come until 1986, long after enormous damage had been done. The Whitey Bulger story isn't ultimately about one criminal, or even about one corrupt FBI agent. It's about institutional corruption, the way that institutions can rationalize serious moral compromises in the name of practical advantage. It's about how the line between law enforcement and crime can blur so completely that they become almost indistinguishable. It's about the reality that American justice doesn't always work the way we're taught it does. Sometimes the powerful, whether criminals or institutions, operate according to different rules. And it's about the cost of that reality. The victims who never receive justice, the families destroyed, the trust in institutions eroded. The question that haunts this story isn't, how did this happen? We now understand how it happened. It happened through choices, through compromises, through institutional decisions made by people who believed they were serving larger purposes. The real question is, could it happen again? The answer, unfortunately, is almost certainly yes. Until institutions are fundamentally reformed, until the incentives that led the FBI to protect Bulger are eliminated, similar arrangements will continue to be possible. Justice in America is real. But so is the reality that justice is not evenly distributed. It depends on your utility to power. It depends on what you know. It depends on what you can offer. The Whitey Bulger case exposed that uncomfortable truth, and whether America has learned from it remains to be seen. This story reveals something that mainstream media often refuses to examine: the reality that our institutions are far more complicated, far more compromised, and far more human than we like to admit. If you want more stories like this, stories that go beneath the surface, that ask hard questions about power and justice and truth, subscribe to this channel right now. Drop a comment below. Did this story change the way you think about the FBI? Do you think similar arrangements still exist today? And share this video. Share it with people who need to understand that justice isn't always about what's right. Sometimes it's about what's useful. The next episode will explore another hidden truth that shook American institutions. You won't believe what you learn. See you in the next chapter.